Tonight, our topic is the Gospel of Thomas, perhaps the most important of the Gospels that was left out of the New Testament. In order to kind of consider Thomas's place in history, I do want to do a little bit of historical context and talk a bit about the Jesus movement and early Christianities. So although the historical Jesus led a movement and had a significant number of disciples, he didn't actually found the Christian church. Christianity, or rather multiple Christianities, arose when the disciples of Jesus tried to decide for themselves what Jesus' execution meant. What had been the point of Jesus' life, his ministry, and death? Different early Christians came up with radically different answers. So as I say, the New Testament is actually made up of multiple texts. They weren't all designed to be together in one grouping the way they are today. And of course, there were lots of other early Christian writings, including Gospels, that did not make it into the New Testament, even though many of these had similar content to books that did make it in. I also want to talk a little bit about one of the types of Christianities, proto-Gnostic Christianity. It exists very early because it is talked about in the New Testament. So we have kind of evidence that some of the earliest Christians who become proto-Orthodox, in other words, the people whose writings do make it into the New Testament, are opposed to Gnostics. So a disciple of Paul who is writing as Paul in the letter of 2 Timothy, he is writing and warning other Christian leaders against people who are likely proto-Gnostics. So he says, avoid empty and world of chatter. Those who indulge in it will stray further and further into godless courses, and the infection of their teaching will spread like gangrene. Such are Hymenaeus and Philetus. They have shot wide of the truth in saying our resurrection has already taken place, and they're upsetting people's faith. So the writer here, who's writing as Paul, is definitely kind of thinking of a literal resurrection that's going to take place in the future. And apparently these other leaders, Hymenaeus and Philetus, are saying, no, the resurrection is really some kind of metaphor, or there's something going on where we're already can be resurrected if we just understand what's truly meant by this. And another character in the book of Acts, which is the second half of Luke's gospel, a person named Simon Magus, is a legendary heretical leader, and he's later listed by Christian historian Irenaeus as one of the founders of Gnosticism. So there's some sense anyway that Gnostics are present at the earliest time. So, however, because Gnosticism was viewed as a heresy by early church leaders, the ones who were the proto-Orthodox who were in the ascendant, from which modern Christianity derives, Gnosticism and Gnostic texts were mostly lost. That changed when an entire library of Gnostic texts were found buried in a jar near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi in 1945 by two Egyptians. So the town of Nag Hammadi is near the monasteries of Saint Pachomius, and the collection would have come from a monastery. So Pachomius is actually the founder of essentially monks living together. Prior to this, monks had gone off as hermits alone in the desert, and now they're coming together into what we think of as monasticism monasteries. Anyway, the collection was ultimately reassembled and made its way to the Coptic Museum in Cairo. So the library, the Nag Hammadi library that's unearthed, is clearly a collection from a person or a group who is interested in Gnosticism, but not all the texts are Gnostic in origin. So for example, the Sixth Codex contains a poor Coptic translation of Plato's Republic. However, that text has been modified to include Gnostic ideas. So essentially a Gnostic writer has re-edited a philosophical text and turned it into sort of a semi-version of Plato and a semi-version of Gnosticism. Many of the texts have been made Gnostic and Christian. For example, in Codex 5, there is another philosophical text called Eunostus the Blessed. So it was originally called that. But in Codex 3, or actually that text is in there. But Codex 3 contains the same text, but crudely divided into sections. And instead of it being by a guy, Eunostus the Blessed, it's put into Christ's mouth in response to questions from his disciples, and it's called the Sophia of Jesus Christ, or the Wisdom of Jesus. And so again, a philosophical text that's unrelated to Christianity is now being made into a Christian text, not very well done in this particular case. So other texts have undergone similar Gnostic redaction. So what I'm just trying to say here is we have a kind of a Gnostic library, and some of them are very important Gnostic texts, original texts, and brilliant texts, but some of them are texts that have been kind of Gnosticized. So let's look at the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is probably the most important text in the Nag Hammadi library for the study of the historical Jesus. So Thomas, as we have it, is a sayings gospel, or in other words, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. And in that sense, it's much like the Lost Sayings Gospel Q. We'll talk about that just a bit. Thomas may preserve then a mid-first century text that has been edited by a Gnostic redactor in the middle of the 2nd century, much like a Gnostic redactor has edited Plato's Republic in the library. So when we're looking at kind of these early texts, we have in this bottom row, these have come down to us now, we have the texts of Matthew, Luke, John, and Thomas, but most scholars don't necessarily believe that these, in the form that we have them, were the original form. We also have Mark. Because the most frequent way scholars understand how the relationship between the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, is that the authors of Matthew and Luke are drawing from Mark. In other words, Mark was written first, and they both have access to Mark, and they have it in front of them, and it is textually dependent, their text on Mark. They are reading from Mark's text, fixing it, correcting it, and so on, changing it so that it fits their understanding. But there's clearly another lost source that Matthew and Luke are both drawing from, because there's a lot of overlap that are also showing literary dependence. And most scholars think that there's a lost second hypothetical source, a sayings gospel, which is called source in German, Quelle, or Q. And so anyway, that's what we mean by Q. Likewise, we've had a whole lecture on this, the Gospel of John, as we now have it, has some very obvious seams where it's kind of clear that a second editor or redactor has come back in and added to the text, and probably edited earlier parts of the earlier part of the text. And so there was at least a first edition, an earlier edition of John, and maybe there's even an additional source that we've talked about before, the Signs Gospel. And so there's another theory here that Thomas, as we now have it, that there's a lost original, and the version that we have has been added to, and then has also certainly been translated into Coptic from the original Greek. So what are sayings gospels? So both the hypothetical Q and Thomas are primarily concerned with the sayings of Jesus. Narrative elements about Jesus's life, for example, those are largely absent. There is no passion story. So in the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John, almost a third of the Gospel is, in all those cases, devoted to Jesus's last week and his trial, death, and resurrection, and so on. Doesn't exist. Indeed, both Q and Thomas don't actually talk really about the resurrection of Jesus. So by contrast, the Gospel of John is really concerned with signs and theology, and it doesn't have any parables. So the different Gospels do have different themes and different interests. So who's Thomas? So in its present form, the Gospel of Thomas is attributed to someone called Didymus Judas Thomas. Thomas is the Aramaic word, and Didymus is the Greek word for twin. So what we're talking about here is a guy named Jude, who is a twin, and we're making sure that you know he's a twin by talking about it in Aramaic and Greek. In later Gnostic texts, including some of the ones we have at Nag Hammadi, Thomas is understood to be the twin mortal brother of the divine Jesus, and thus he's a very important figure in Gnosticism. And so the idea here is there's a guy named Jude, and we do have a book in the New Testament that's attributed to Jude, and the author of Jude in that book says that he is Jude, the brother of James, and in the book of James, James is the brother of Jesus. And so anyway, this is Jude, who's the twin brother of Jesus, according anyway to the fact that he's Jesus' twin as opposed to somebody else's twin is what is only spelled out in later Gnosticism. It doesn't actually say that in the Gospel of Thomas as we have it either. There's pairings of divine and mortal twins is very common in antiquity. So in Hellenistic religion mythology, there are bunches of examples. The most famous is Gemini, of the constellation, the zodiac. And so the mortal Castor has the divine twin Pollux. So these are essentially fraternal twins where they have the same mother, but in one case the father is a god, in the other case is the mortal husband of the mother, and that produces like a divine mortal pairing of twins. Likewise, people maybe don't know it as well, but anyway, Hercules is one of the most famous demigods. He is a kind of a demigod and an immortal because has a god for a father, but he has a twin, his mortal brother Iphicles. And so this is a Greek vase that's showing Heracles and Iphicles, or Hercules as he's known in English and Latin. Okay, so as we're going to look at and try to wrestle with the Gospel of Thomas and its significance, what I want to say is scholars are very divided in their conclusions about this gospel. And so some date it as early as 60 AD, and therefore making it very, very important indeed. Others would rather cast it out and date it as late as 250 AD, essentially saying it's not important at all. So today we're going to review 4 of the major proposals that are put forth by competing scholars. So the first is we have a late text that is dependent on the New Testament. So Thomas as a late text dependent on all the other New Testament texts having already been written and access to those. Number 2 is Thomas an early text that is actually preserving an independent witness to Jesus. So that would be a very important text indeed. 3, is it a late text, Gnostic text that is relevant only to the study of Gnosticism? And 4, is it a proto-Gnostic text, though one that is actually quite early, and thus showing that Gnostic Christians were around and that they were early and an important part of early Christian dialogue. Anyway, so it's a pretty big spectrum, and again, even within the early and late, scholars don't agree and they have rather different positions. So I want to take first, anyway, this idea that Thomas is in fact a dependent harmonization. So Thomas, in this case, the idea is that Thomas already has the author of Thomas has the Gospels of Matthew and Luke in his or her possession and is composing the text based on that. So the idea here is that because Matthew and Luke, for example, drew from the lost source text Q, they often have sayings that are similar, but that they have themselves edited and changed a little bit. And so some of the scholars here are arguing that Thomas is actually saying, okay, well, there's differences between these Matthew and Luke sayings. Let's harmonize them and bring them back into union, make them, we'll take some from Matthew and some from Luke and make the saying whole again. So here's an example. So Jesus has a teaching here about the poor and the kingdom. And so in Luke 6:20, we read, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." Matthew, by contrast, renders the same saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And so both of them probably, according to, I think in this case is a more scholarly consensus, or anyway, at least the majority position, Luke are both including a saying that they are deriving, that they have found in the Q source on the relationship between the poor and the kingdom. And I think most scholars also agree, if we were to look at what the original in Q would have been, that it would have been much closer to the way that Luke has it, and that Matthew here has made the additions and done the editing. So Luke's reading is shorter and it's a more difficult teaching. So Jesus is saying here, no, blessed are the poor. Matthew is adding here saying, well, let's spiritualize this. No, blessed are the poor in spirit. And so it's a weird phrase. People have trouble understanding even what it's trying to mean when people when people try to teach it. But I guess it means the people who are humble. But it's making a difficult teaching into an easier teaching, and yet it's somewhat more. It doesn't really work as a saying. And then Matthew, just as a quirk or as a characteristic, often when he's finding the words kingdom of God in Mark's text or in Q, Matthew prefers to say kingdom of heaven, and so he'll edit that way. Okay, so when we look at the saying, the same saying as it's found in the Gospel of Thomas, saying 54, Jesus said, blessed are the poor, for to you belongs heaven's kingdom. And so Thomas doesn't include the in spirit part, but we do have heaven's kingdom. And so Thomas does prefer to talk about the kingdom of heaven as being, the kingdom of God as with the word heaven as opposed to with the word God. Okay, let's look at another case of potential for people to put forward about harmonization. So in Luke chapter 12, Jesus is talking about being the cause of division. Jesus says in this, again, drawing from Q, Luke renders it, I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. So Matthew's version lacks the part about the world on fire, and also the part about the household division, 3 against 2, and so on. And he does change it a little bit up to here, or he keeps preserves the original depending on which is original in Q. So in Matthew we read, do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword, as opposed to division. For I've come to set man against father, daughter against mother, and so on. And one's foes will be members of one's own household. And so anyway, it's a little bit different, but it's similar to how you can see the similarities of this saying. It's the same saying with different edits. So let's look at this in Thomas. In Thomas 10 and 16, we have Jesus said, I cast fire upon the world, and look, I'm guarding it until it blazes. So that's similar to the fiery statement, although a little different from in Luke. And then in Thomas 16, Jesus said, people think that I have come to cast peace on the world. They do not know that I have come to cast conflicts on the earth, fire, sword, war. For there'll be 5 in a house, there'll be 3 against 2, and 2 against 3, father against son, son against father, and they will stand alone. So Thomas here has the fire, the sword, and the 3 against 2, and so on. So in that sense, possibly this is a harmonization of the two sayings as we find them in their Matthewan and Lucan versions. But there is some stuff that gets left out. So father against son, son against mother, this whole mother-in-law against daughter-in-law thing, that's kind of a memorable part. And if Thomas is a harmonizer, what we can kind of say is that the editor is relatively aggressive in the deletions. A lot of times when we have a harmonizer, including when Matthew, for example, is trying to bring in Mark and Q sources, Matthew will include both of them, because most harmonizers anyway, or they often err on the side of just adding instead of deleting. If Thomas has Luke and Matthew's texts, Thomas feels very free to simply just pick and choose little bits instead of including deleting a lot, instead of keeping the whole thing. Okay, so that's a case for Thomas as a harmonizer of Matthew and Luke. Here's the next one, is a case for an independent witness. So is an earlier portion of Thomas, a kernel of the text as we have it now, does it preserve an independent witness from the oral tradition of Jesus? So a number of scholars believe this and make this proposal as well, including often a lot of the scholars of Q. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about oral tradition and how it even works. It's a lot easier, for example, to remember something like a song than an essay. So you probably memorize a lot of poetry, especially in the form of popular songs. And so I was able to just think of some ballads like, "Now John at the bar is a friend of mine. He gets me my drinks for free. He's quick with a joke or to light up a smoke, but there's someplace he'd rather be. He says, 'Bill, I believe this is killing me,' as a smile ran away from his face. Well, I'm sure that I could be a movie star if I could get out of this place." In other words, that's easy they'll run off the tongue. You probably don't even need the words in order to sing ballads like this. It may not be the Piano Man as well as this one, but you might know another ballad and you can just sing it without writing. And so one of the traditional ways of composing things orally and transmitting it orally, like for example the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer, or the Quran, they're composed orally as poetry that can be memorized and repeated. And as is clearly true with the Iliad and the Odyssey, prior to when it gets written down and we have sort of the canonical version of the text, the bards who are repeating, the oral poets who are repeating Homer, are actually maybe composing it and recomposing it and so on with every performance, but lots of it remains the same. But that's how the oral tradition works. And there's a lot of sense, actually, even though this is not one of the tenets of Islam, that Quran was maybe similar because there were lots and lots of variations in the oral tradition of Quran prior to when it all got brought together in the succeeding generations, written down and canonized in the form that we have it today. But anyway, up to this day, thousands of children all around the world memorize Quran. So you can do this in the same way you could memorize a very long song. This wasn't the strategy, anyway, that Jesus had as a teacher. So he didn't write like some long poetic text to explain his teachings. Rather, he taught in sayings that were memorable and remembered and transmitted by his disciples. Nevertheless, the sayings as we have them are rather distant from us, from the historical Jesus. What we have is distant from what Jesus actually taught. The spoken language of the day in Galilee and Judea is Aramaic, and Jesus would have taught in that language. But all of our earliest texts of his sayings are in Greek. And so, although it was once thought that Matthew was composed first in Aramaic and that it was then translated into Greek, that's based on a statement by a very early Christian named Papias. But all literary analysis has shown that Papias he's mistaken. Whatever he meant in his very, I think, ambiguous statement that led people to think that Matthew was in fact an Aramaic gospel originally, but it hasn't shown to be the case. Excuse me. So in other words, Jesus' spoken statements were taught in Aramaic. That went around for decades among his disciples who would go out, apostles who were going out and preaching in the Spirit, teaching Jesus what Jesus had taught in Aramaic. And then later, as they were the other lingua franca of the East, Greek, ever since Alexander the Great, Greek had been the language of the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And so those statements were translated into Greek and then taught again in the oral tradition. And it's only then that they're written down, those Greek statements. So the saying circulated for decades and jumped from Aramaic to Greek before they were recorded in the text that we now have. And so while oral transmission does have the capacity to preserve sayings intact, it's completely possible for oral transmission to do that. Nevertheless, it can also function like a game of telephone, where each hearer changes the saying when it's their turn to teach it. And so that also is shown to be the case as tradition that oral people, let's say people who are preserving an oral tradition, even now in the 21st century, in some cases it's been merged with their ancient traditions, but we can determine when the contamination happens. In other words, when a new idea got introduced to it, and that new idea, let's say, got introduced in, let's say, 1930, and it seems to have the same antiquity in the tradition anyway, as maybe the most ancient part of the tradition, but they can't tell the difference themselves because oral tradition has just mixed it all up together. Okay, so in Jesus's sayings, it turns out that we have lots of alternate versions of what are probably the same saying in the various texts we have that survive. So if we look, for example, about this saying about the first and the last, multiple iterations have been preserved. So we have in Mark, many of the first will be last, and of the last, many will be first. Matthew, who is drawing from Mark, retains that same statement almost exactly the same way. But then Matthew has a doublet because Matthew is also either drawing from his own material, or it's from Hugh here. So the last will be first and the first last. Luke, again, kind of pulling from the Mark statement here, has, and remember, those who will be first are last, and those who will be last are first. And then we have in Thomas another version of this. For many of the first will be last and will become a single one, which, as we'll see, kind of shows signs of the kind of the general Thomas redactor. So in other words, there might have been a last and first last saying here that has gotten edited to include a theme that the editor of Thomas likes. But in any event, we have multiple versions. When scholars look at these, the last will be first and the first will be last seems like that may be the closest to what the original would have been. And then as editors add things, they want to soften it, and they say, well, it's just many of the first will be last and many of the last will be first. In other words, they don't want to really say the last is going to be first and the first is last, but it may well be. So this is a harsher saying, but it's also maybe a one that it transmits easier, but you can see why it might get added onto, right? Okay, so in that doublet we saw from Matthew, what may well have happened here is Jesus said the one thing, it got passed along through that oral tradition. That first version got to Mark, which went sort of directly into Matthew's compilation. That second version may well have been in Q or some other Matthewan source, because it's not duplicated in Luke, so we don't know for sure in this case. In any event, Matthew here as a harmonizer has erred in the sense of putting both of them together or including both of them in different parts of his gospel in order to not delete anything. Anyway, there's lots of other, all kinds of other sayings of Jesus are preserved in multiple variants. We have one of these here that's something like, in Mark anyway, it exists as, remember, those who try to save their own life are going to lose it, but those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the good news are going to save it. And that same version, drawing from Mark, is repeated in Matthew and Luke. But Matthew and Luke both have their own saying that's probably derived from Q. So whoever tries to hang on to life will forfeit it, and whoever forfeits life will preserve it. And then finally, again, in the gospel, in this case, in the Gospel of John, there's another variation of this saying of Jesus that would be essentially circulating all by itself, since John isn't necessarily drawing from any of these other texts. So those who love life will lose it, but those who hate life in this world will preserve it for unending real life. So I just bring these out to show, in a lot of cases, a harmonizer is going to keep doublets and create doublets by not deleting stuff, and that these sayings are circulating and they might finding their way into multiple gospels. Okay, so which variant is closest to the original? So because editors are more likely to add than delete, and because they're more likely to soften a difficult or embarrassing teaching, scholars usually argue that the shorter and more difficult or more embarrassing reading is the more likely to be the closer to the original way it was taught. So let's look at an example of this. So on the saying regarding hometown respect for prophets, Mark's original saying here is, Jesus said to them, prophets are not without honor except in their own hometown and among their own kin and in their own house. So there are variants of this actually in Luke and Matthew, who are following and actually editing and adding Mark, and then we also have a version in Thomas. So Luke has kind of edited this up to say, and you will say, do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did in Capernaum. And he said, truly, I tell you that no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. In Matthew, we have it, they took offense at him, but Jesus said to him, prophets are not without honor except in their own country and in their own house. And he did not do many deeds of power there because of their unbelief. And finally, we have in John, when 2 days were over, he went to that place, from that place to Galilee, for Jesus himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in the prophet's own country. Thomas's version, Jesus said, no prophet is welcome on his home turf. Doctors don't cure those who know them. So Thomas' variant about prophets getting no respect at home is among the shortest, and it's connected here with a short saying about the doctors that's also found in expanded form in Luke, which we'll look at. It does not include apologetic arguments about why Jesus was not respected. So in other words, the fact that people don't respect Jesus in his hometown, Matthew wants to say that's because it's not because he wasn't working miracles or he wasn't the Messiah, but it's because the people in Galilee lacked faith, as explicitly said or written into Matthew. This also happens in parables. So let's look at this example. In Mark 12, we have the parable of the wicked tenants. And he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. But they seized him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again, he sent another slave to them. This one they beat over the head and insulted. So he sent another, and that one they killed. So it was with many others. Some they beat, others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. When they realized he had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd, so they left him and went away. Okay, so Mark has a pretty long and extended version of that parable, including a lot of explanation about what it means. And as they usually do, the authors of Matthew and Luke retell the story as found in the Mark. Generally, what they do is they elevate Mark's grammar. Mark is a fairly simple writer of Greek, may not have been a native Greek speaker. Matthew and Luke are much more well-spoken authors in terms of their Greek. And they also expand on the parable's interpretation. It's a long parable, so I won't read their entire versions. Instead, I'm going to show what the Thomas's version of the wicked tenets in sayings 56 and 65 and 66. Jesus said, "A person owned a vineyard and rented it to some farmers so that they could work it and he could collect its crop from them. He sent his slaves so the farmers would give him the vineyard's crop. They grabbed him and beat him and almost killed him, and the slave returned and told his master. His master said, perhaps he didn't know them. He sent another slave, and the farmers beat that one as well. Then the master sent his son and said, perhaps they'll show my son some respect. But the farmers knew that he was heir to the vineyard. They grabbed him and killed him. Anyone with 2 ears had better listen." Jesus said, "Show me the stone the builders rejected. That is the keystone." So Thomas here preserves a much shorter version. Especially the lacking here are elements that transform the parable into an allegory. So in other words, we don't hear that the man's son here is this beloved son. In other words, which is kind of making it an allegory of God sending all kinds of prophets, let's say servants, to the Jewish people, and then finally sending the son, and then obviously then Jesus is killed. And so in other words, that's what the implication in the Mark story is. This story is what it exactly means is open to dialogue, which is more like what other parables or early parables of Jesus are like. An example here again is the parable of the sower. So in Mark 4, we read, Jesus began to teach them many things in parables. And in his teaching, he said to them, listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched. Since it had no root, it was withered away. Other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell into good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. And he said, let anyone with ears to hear listen. So once again, Matthew and Luke follow this closely. One of the major differences anyway is that Matthew reverses the yield order. So he's saying some had 100-fold, some 60, some 30, as opposed to the other way around. Luke simplifies it and just says it yields 100-fold, and so not the 30 and 60. So there's not 3 different yields in the Luke version. Here's the Thomas version. Thomas 9, Jesus said, look, the sower went out, took a handful of seeds and scattered them. Some fell on the road, and the birds came and gathered them. Others fell on rock, and they didn't take root in the soil and didn't produce heads of grain. Others fell on thorns, and they choked the seeds, and worms ate them. Others fell on good soil, and it produced a good crop. It yielded 60 per measure and 120 per measure. So once again here, Thomas' variant is shorter and it's simpler, and so therefore it seems to make more sense as a rhetorical teaching. You have the sower, 3 types of bad soil. They reap 3 different types of yields. It's only 2 in Thomas's, and so one of those has been lost, but it's probably originally more like in Mark. There's 3 types of yields that are probably 30, 60, and 120. So tripling or doubling and doubling. Okay, well, just one more of these. The parable of the mustard seed. It's as recorded in Matthew. So Matthew here is drawing again on a parable that he found in Mark, but he changes it a little, and I want to highlight that here. So Matthew 13, we read, Jesus, put them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed it in his field. The mustard seed, is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown into the greatest of shrubs, it becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. And so what may be happening here is we're talking about the kingdom of heaven, and it's becoming a tree in Matthew. That portion of it is added. That isn't in the Markan version of this that Matthew's drawing from. And so perhaps Matthew here is trying to kind of elevate this teaching because he would like the kingdom of God here to be compared to the cosmic tree, for example, that's found in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, chapter 4, verse 11, where that cosmic tree whose top reached the heavens. Okay, here's the mustard seed parable in Thomas, saying 20. The disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us what heaven's kingdom is like." He said to them, "It's like a mustard seed, the smallest of all seeds, but when it falls on prepared soil, it produces a large plant and becomes a shelter for the birds of the sky." And so rather than making a cosmic tree out of a mustard plant, Thomas, I think, retains here the idea that mustard is actually generally a weed. And what it does is it overtakes everything, not because it grows so tall, but because once you start planting something like mustard, it just grows without control. And so it's not the expected kind of grand metaphor for the kingdom of God. It's like saying something like the kingdom of God is like a bunch of weeds that is going to overtake everything. Okay. If the current text of Thomas, as these scholars are suggesting, is an expansion of an early sayings gospel, the original might not have been attributed to Thomas. In other words, the attribution that's at the front may have been added by the later editor, the later expander and redactor. And in fact, actually saying 12 shows amazing reverence for Jesus' brother, James the Just. James is a historical figure who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem after Jesus' death. In saying 12, we read, "The disciples said to Jesus, 'We know that you are going to leave us. Who will be our leader?' And Jesus said to them, 'No matter where you are to go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being.'" So heaven and earth came into being for the sake of James the Just. So James has a very elevated position here and is certainly listed as the successor, anyway, in this saying of Thomas. And so that's not as normal for Gnostic groups to revere James in that way. James is associated essentially with the Jerusalem group, with the group which are more like Jewish Christians who are continuing to follow Jewish law. And indeed, that's why he's called James the Just. Just here is a translation for James, the guy who's following the law, following the rules. So James' historicity is actually verified by his antagonist, Paul. Paul is a historical figure we do know for sure, and who is also the earliest writer we have who's a Christian. Paul says that he met James. James's historicity is also confirmed by the Jewish historian Josephus, and they both talk about him as the leader of the movement in Jerusalem after Jesus' death. In many places in Paul's writings and also in the writings in the New Testament that are attributed to James and to Jude, there's a sense that this group is called the poor of Jerusalem. And it may be people who are living almost sort of like in a kind of a quasi-monastic sense, which is to say they have left off worldly pursuits and are instead living on charity and praying. And so they are praying for their daily bread and asking people to give them that bread as alms. So anyway, that may well be what that group is like. So if this is the case, in other words, if Thomas has a first edition and we could identify some of the texts as being part of that and some being additions of a later proto-Gnostic redactor or editor, and if an early text is connected to James's church, it's possible then that both this early Thomas and also Q, these two sayings gospels, these two hypothetical sayings gospels, though, Q is very connected to Galilee and is also talking about kind of teachings that are more accustomed to like peasants and rural farmers as opposed to city teachings that are in some of the later Gospels. And so then the earliest parts of Thomas are possibly among the closest sources to the teachings of the historical Jesus, and so in which case it would therefore be very important. And this is why this is such a controversial but also important hypothesis. So if it's true, what do we get from this view? So the fact that Thomas exists is itself, just in whatever version, the one that we have, the edited version, it confirms anyway that sayings gospels were an actual genre. And so when Q was first hypothesized, it was thought, well, there must have been a sayings gospel. And people said, well, there's no such thing as a sayings gospel. Well, they later found a sayings gospel, so that part at least has been proved out. If Thomas is an independent early witness, it provides confirmation actually then for many sayings which were previously unique to Luke, Matthew, or John. So there's a bunch of sayings that so Matthew is working like Luke from Q and Mark, but there'll lots of parts of Matthew are distinctly Matthewan, and some parts of Luke are distinctly Luke. So the prodigal son only exists in the one text. Same thing, a lot of the sayings in John are only in John. Now with Thomas, there's actually a bunch of the sayings that are unique that actually have a Thomas variant. And it's also true that there are some potentially early sayings of Jesus that are found only in Thomas. One of the most interesting examples is Thomas 97, the parable of the empty jar. It goes like this. Jesus said, "The Father's kingdom is like a woman who was carrying a jar full of meal. While she was walking along a distant road, the handle of the jar broke and the meal spilled behind her along the road. She didn't know it. She hadn't noticed a problem. When she reached her house, she put the jar down and discovered it was empty." So it's kind of an interesting thing. So the kingdom of God, the Father's kingdom, is like a woman carrying a jar full of meal. And it's ultimately, in the course of carrying it, the meal is gone, the jar is empty. So, like many of Jesus' other parables about the kingdom here, the teaching encourages deeper thinking and dialogue. This isn't a simple allegory where we can just say, what's the kingdom? What's Jesus? What's the gospel here in the course of this teaching? It's a teaching that requires us to think about deep meaning. All right, so that's that case. I want to now look at the cases for Thomas as a proto-Gnostic text. And of course, as we said, it's found at Nag Hammadi in a collection that includes many Gnostic texts, and that makes the case that Thomas, at the minimum, was very valued by Gnostics. In its present form, Thomas includes many Gnostic or proto-Gnostic sayings, and so this implication, though, has led different scholars to very different conclusions. So one of them is, perhaps this text is really only, all it can tell us about is just what Gnosticism is about. So scholars like Bart Ehrman see Thomas as dependent on Matthew and Luke. Thomas, then, for him, is simply a late 2nd century work of a Gnostic Christian who picked sayings out from canonical texts that best fit Gnostic views and then harmonized them. This editor then added Gnostic sayings or created them themselves and attributed them to Jesus, which makes really Thomas relevant only to the study of Gnosticism. Still be very interesting, and as are all of the other Gnostic Gospels, for us to learn about this other thriving and interesting branch of Christianity, early Christianity. However, other scholars like Elaine Pagels argue that the Gnostic text is itself early. So Pagel argues that the primary author of the Gospel of John is aware of the Gospel of Thomas in its form that we have it. And so in other words, that person who's writing, let's say, around the year 90 or 100, already has access to the full Thomas the way we have it. And so therefore the Gnostic redaction, or if it was just written entirely by a Gnostic, that happened before the Gospel of John was composed. And if so, then Thomas's Gnostic sayings are an early and influential part of 1st century Christian dialogue. So let's look a little bit about what the Gnosticism of Thomas is like and what is meant by that. And so we've been talking about what is the kingdom of God. We've already seen the saying about the woman with the jar. Here's another saying in Thomas 3. Jesus said, If your leaders say to you, look, the Father's kingdom is in the sky, in other words, heaven is literally up there in the sky, then the birds of the sky will precede you to heaven, right? If they say to you it's in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the Father's kingdom is within you and it is outside you. So, like I say, Jesus taught about the kingdom of God, but early Christians had very different interpretations. Thomas here, and actually elsewhere throughout the text, is rejecting the idea that the kingdom will be founded after a literal apocalypse, or that the kingdom literally exists in the heavens for people who were involved in the afterlife, let's say. That saying goes on. There's another saying here. What was it? We were just saying 3. So that was that was saying 3 verses 1 through 3. This is going to go on through saying 3 verses 4 through 5. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you live in poverty, and you are the poverty. So if the kingdom is not literally in the heavens, what is it? So what this is probably doing here, the rest of this teaching, is defining, accessing the kingdom that is within you and outside of you as a process of coming to understanding the underlying truth or truths of the universe, knowing yourself. So let's look at a couple teachings in Thomas about divine light, which Elaine Pagels thinks the author of the Gospel of John doesn't like and is reacting to a little bit. So in Thomas 77, we read, Jesus said, I am the light that is over all things. I am from me all came forth, and to me all attained. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up a stone, and you will find me there. So Jesus here is identifying himself with the divine light present with the Creator in the first chapter of Genesis. So in the beginning, God said, let there be light, and there was light. And also with the Word, so that word that God is saying in the beginning, the Logos, through which all things were created. But the saying is going on to saying, I am all, and also that same divine light is in absolutely everything, including wood, stone, and so forth, inanimate matter. So it's much more, let's say, expansive view of Jesus as the divine light here. By contrast, in John chapter 1, 1 through 5 and 14, we have a similar idea, but not expressed the same way. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. So in the same way God is saying, let there be light, having the Word, that Word is with God. All things came into being through that Word, through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. So there is an equation here of Jesus as Christ with the Logos and with the divine light. But we have very clearly, though, also the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. So I'm going to contrast a couple more here of these sayings of light, which are different. Even though there's a lot of abstract thinking here between Thomas and John, there's distinctions that may well be very, very important to the two writers. So in Thomas 24, we read, his disciples, Jesus' disciples said, show us the place where you are, for we must seek it. And Jesus said to them, anyone here with 2 ears had better listen. There is light within a person of light, and it shines on the whole world. If it does not shine, it is dark. And then in Thomas 50, saying 50 verse 1, Jesus said, if they say to you, where have you come from? Say to them, we have come from the light, from the place where the light came into being by itself, established itself, and appeared in their image. So again, it seems to be talking about going back to that creation story, but there is also a lot more talk here anyway about being persons of light and places of light, and there being a place of light than we get in other Christian texts, including in John. So in John 14, Jesus says, "In a little while, the world will no longer see me, but you will see me because I live. Because I live, you also will live. On that day, you will know that I am in the Father, and you in me, and I in you." So there's a lot of overlap here. The Gospel of John is agreeing that Christ is the divine light, present at the creation, and so on. And that also the Gospel here has a sense that humans are in Christ and Christ are in us. But this text stops short of assigning divine light to wood and rocks, and also to saying that that all things came through Christ in the creation, but not all things are Christ. So once again, with all of these kind of light teachings, in Thomas, spiritual attainment is the goal. So there's no mention in the text of a literal resurrection in Thomas. Instead, death is defeated through, kind of like I say, a spiritual attainment. So at the very beginning of the text, first and second sayings, and Jesus said, "Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." Actually, that could either be Jesus or Thomas, that first saying. Jesus then said, "Those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. When they find, they will be disturbed. When they are disturbed, they will marvel and will reign over all. And after they've reigned, they will rest." So this is a variation on the ask it shall be open to you, seek and you will find. What you're finding here, when you're finding this truth about the universe that is at the heart of the Gospel of Thomas's message, you're going to be disturbed by it. But that's going to also create within you the sense of marvel as you now finally get it. You're just going to have a, whoa, I get it now. And that will cause you to essentially be your own, you aren't going to be subject to all of the problems in the world because you're above it now, because you have this knowledge. By contrast, the Gospel of John presents a literal resurrection. So John not only has the risen Jesus in a story appear to the disciples, he then includes an episode where the Apostle Thomas doubts the resurrection. And this doesn't exist in any of the Matthew, Mark, or Luke. But we read in John 20, "But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, 'We've seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails in my hands, in his side, I will not believe.'" So Thomas here, to whom the Gospel of Thomas is attributed, is presented in the Gospel of John as a doubter of the resurrection, a doubter of a literal resurrection. And indeed, if the author of John then has the Gospel of Thomas, he might be using this as an argument against that text. Here's Thomas not getting it. Also, the Gospel of John presents Thomas as ignorant of the existence of a literal heaven. So in John 14, we read, "In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And you know the way to the place where I am going." And Thomas said to him, "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" And Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." So, is then John also an anti-Thomas polemic, as Elaine Pagels and other scholars are suggesting? So the relationship of John to the Synoptic Gospels is also very much debated. And so we don't, this is another one of the things, there are multiple academic positions that are defensible on all of these questions. So there is considerable overlap in John in the Passion account with the Passion account in Mark. So that's one of the parts of lots of the Gospel of John has episodes and Jesus doing things that are just not like anything else in any of the other Gospels. But when it starts getting to the Passion story, the story of Jesus' last week and his trial and execution especially, there's a lot of overlap with Mark. And so scholars originally speculated, well, is there a lost Passion Gospel that both Mark and John had access to? But the problem with that as a theory is that people have looked at the Passion account in Mark, and it does contain so many Markan elements that it's hard to imagine that Mark didn't just compose this and create it. And so the overlap, then the implication of that is that perhaps even though John is not literarily dependent on Mark, so John is never doing this thing where he's got the text, the author of John has the text of Mark in front of him and is copying word for word the way Luke and Matthew do, in other words, so that we see the literary dependence. It may well be, though, that the author of John is writing after Mark is circulating and knows the story from Mark, even if they're not reworking it directly. So if that's argued, that's not for sure. That's a speculative case on the relationship between the Gospel of John and the Synoptic Gospels, especially Mark. So if Pagels is correct, the relationship between John and Thomas is quite similar. In other words, that it's not literarily dependent, but there are things about the Gospel of Thomas and teachings in the Gospel of Thomas that are offending the author of John, who has access to Mark and Thomas. And as a result, John is correcting those teachings, and as far as he's concerned, and also writing episodes or creating episodes where the Apostle Thomas is wrong about a bunch of stuff, which again doesn't exist in the synoptic stories. Okay, so we can't, end a lecture on the Gospel of Thomas without getting to the problematic final saying. The very last saying of the Gospel of Thomas, number 114, we read, Simon Peter said to them, so all of the assembled disciples, the disciples included Mary Magdalene, who's one of the leading disciples or even apostles in many of the traditions. He said to them, make Mary leave us, for females do not deserve to live. Jesus said, look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Wow. Okay. So that is maybe especially, I think, especially on its surface, a messed up teaching, but in our present day context, especially. And I think it's going to be ironic that that in some ways Gnosticism and possibly even this teaching, as sexist as this sounds on its surface and actually is, that part of the problem here is that all of these sayings, the ancient world is inherently a very, very sexist place. There's a lot of egalitarianism in early Christianity. Paul is saying, people are no longer male nor female, nor but one in Christ Jesus. And there's lots of indications that the earliest apostles, and they're being sent out in pairs, there would be a male apostle and a female apostle, certainly in the traditions that'll be traveling together in twos. And Paul certainly says that many of the apostles travel with their wife as their companions. In other words, the two of them, a male and female pairing, but he's been criticized for having male companions instead of following that tradition. Anyway, so there's a lot of other reasons why early Christianity is sometimes quite egalitarian. But nevertheless, there's also emerging teachings in early Christianity that we have both from Paul and from others, where people are arguing, well, women shouldn't even be allowed to preach in church or speak in church, or they should have their head covered, and that, so on and so forth. And so there is a debate in terms of the early Christian communities about the level of egalitarianism, and certainly by attributing this first statement to Peter, one of the things that's going on here is that the Gnostics, while they look to apostles like Thomas and Mary as being kind of the important apostles who really get it, they look at apostles like Peter as being kind of the dim-witted apostles who don't get it. And they are probably putting themselves in opposition to people who essentially are emerging as the proto-Orthodox Christians, the Christians who ultimately believe that Peter went to Rome and became the first pope, for example, is certainly an early tradition that happens. And so the people in the Matthewan community that are claiming Peter, Matthew records a statement of Jesus that you are Peter, and upon this rock, Peter means rock, upon you I will build my church, and I will give you the keys to the kingdom, and so on. And that statement, though, exists only in Matthew. So that's not in Mark or Luke or John or Thomas. And so in other words, the Matthewan community definitely is like promoting the authority of Peter among the different apostles. The Thomas community is actually sort of undercutting the authority of Peter, the same way that Elaine Pagels was arguing that the John community was arguing, undercutting the Thomas community's authority by saying that Thomas is a doubter, Thomas doesn't get it, and so on. And so this is this harsh statement that females don't deserve life, by which he means to say here true life, eternal life. In other words, females are not suitable for philosophy. That's a statement that is antagonistic here, but it's actually the author is probably essentially saying Peter is a dummy, and Peter's saying things that are wrong. He's saying things that lots and lots of people in the very sexist Greco-Roman and also Jewish worlds of the time were saying, which is you can't teach philosophy to women or something like that. They aren't going to be able to live the good life of the philosophers, the true life of the Gnostics, right? And Jesus says, no, that's not the case. But what is he saying now? So I'll guide her to make her male so that she may be a living spirit that resembles you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, so this is this is probably referencing a couple cosmological ideas. So in that same Genesis creation story, humankind is made in the image of God, but in the same way that lightness and darkness are divided into night, are divided, and day and night are divided, humankind is divided male and female, but neither is whole, right? So it's only when two become one and they're combined anyway into becoming whole, and that you're going to be like things at the end are going to be like things at the beginning. And so in general, I would say in the kind of world of contemporary Greek philosophy, Aristotle teaches hierarchy, and he more or less says outright that the hierarchy in humans is males are superior to females. And so that's a given kind of worldview background. And so what's actually probably going on here is potentially a very, is for its time, what's supposed to be, what they're trying to do is have a positive teaching, which is to say, we're actually all going to be egalitarian, but given the fact that contemporarily, everybody thinks females are lesser than males, what Jesus here is saying, as a Gnostic here is saying, is that everybody's going to be on the same level. But anyway, because the entire background here is coming from this entire sexist background, it comes off as still sexist, no matter how much that it's trying to maybe even be against it, because that's just the way that it was. And so this is one of the problems that we have when we're dealing with ancient texts. A lot of times, if they just didn't talk about this, we wouldn't assume. We just assume that it's fairly egalitarian. But once they kind of bring it out, or once they start talking about things, then we start to realize, oh yeah, that's what this worldview was really like back then. So anyway, that's going to be how I would address this. I do think it's a problematic part of the text, and so that's why I didn't want to end without it. but I do hope that that all of this has shown what kind of an interesting text this is, and whatever our view is after we let's say read and digest it, whether we think it's very early and an early witness, whether we are excited about the Gnostic teachings and whether we think the Gnostic teachings make it irrelevant. It's an interesting text. It's very short and it's well worth a read. So I suggest that you just Google it and have a read. It's very, very interesting. Thank you. All right. And so we've had a bunch of questions in the comments in the both of the chat windows in YouTube and also on Facebook. And so I just want to read a few of those and respond to a few of those. I think early on when we were looking at the diagrams and we were talking about the oral transmission, how Jesus was speaking in Aramaic, and ultimately and then it got translated into Greek through the oral tradition, and then it's the Greek that got written down. The little diagram had Jesus saying something with Aramaic letters and also Hebrew, and Elizabeth points out that she could read that from Hebrew saying Yeshua, which is to say Joshua, which is Jesus's name in Hebrew and Aramaic and so on, and so that's correct. So that's what it was. That's what we did there. And then the Greek that he says when it transmits, it says Yesus, which is the Greek for Yeshua, which is to say Jesus' actual name is Joshua, right? So appreciate that. Thank you. John Johnson, he wrote, as an aside, I was perusing in the bookstore or library a long time ago a book by Jane Fonda, and she spoke very fondly of the Gospel of Thomas. She found it to be more about spirituality than religion, something like that. And so, yeah, we've had a lot of discussions here about what's the difference between religion and spirituality, and I think it's hard to pin both of those kind of words down, but in the kind of the popular sense of that, I can totally see where Jane Fonda would have been coming from in that way. So I think that because Thomas and especially as we have it now, and certainly also Gnosticism is definitely a more fully spiritualized religion. It does kind of, I think, feel more spiritual than, let's say, a religion that is based on rules or rituals or something like that. Shaheen mentioned, I'm going to read this here. Oh, yeah, I don't have the whole thing, Leandro, because you copied C more, not. So we'll get to Sheehan in a second. So Beth Joel Dublakis asked, is there an argument for Thomas actually being Q? And the problem with that is that no. So people initially thought, when they first got it, they thought maybe this is Q. But actually, there has been so much study now into the Q source and trying to figure out exactly what was in Q and what the original text would have looked like. And the Thomas text is simply too different, and it isn't necessarily there isn't necessarily direct literary dependence. And so, since there's not direct literary dependence, what we're probably dealing with is that there are lots of Jesus' sayings that are circulating, and they're primarily circulating orally. At a certain point, different people write sayings lists down, and some of those sayings might have just been circulating just as the one saying. You know, people quoted Jesus and did that, but at a certain point, there's like some editors will have compiled something together or compiled a list together, and both Q and Thomas maybe have somewhat of an internal structure anyway, and they're not the same, and so they're not literally dependent. They're both part of the same genre, but not the same. Dega Vertigols says the idea of overcoming death in Thomas 1 in a non-resurrection sense is more consistent with Gnostic thought, or does it jive with proto-orthodoxy? It's more consistent with Gnostic thought. And so the idea that when Jesus is saying, saying you won't taste death, and the answer like I say in the beginning here of Thomas 1, that you're doing that because you are, finding out about yourself, and then you're finding out about the truth, essentially the mystery, then when you find out what life is about, you're going to be disturbed. That's going to be very disturbing, but that will also that will also allow you to understand how the universe works, which is going to set you free in a different way. So that's what true life is, as opposed to a literal resurrection, which many other Christians were very much imagining they were going to experience within their own lifetime. So there's a whole group of apocalyptic Christians who, are really seeing the dead rising and are also, or have heard stories of that and believe that's the case. And they're also anticipating that there will be an apocalypse with a full resurrection of everybody, or the blessed at the end of time very soon. So I would say that saying jives with Gnosticism, and so for the for the people who are arguing that there is a saying source embedded within Thomas that's not Gnostic, that first saying is one of the ones that would have been added. But that's not the case for everybody. Okay, Kathy Sharp. Whoa, I was really fond of the Gospel of Thomas until there's this misogynist closer. Yes, I think that's probably true for everybody. There is, unfortunately, I wish they hadn't added that or kept that last saying, because it would be very much a different sale for everybody. I think that the reality is there are some uncomfortable sayings in all of the Gospels that are already in the canon, right? And so Paul says some very uncomfortable things about women and so on, and people then maybe just don't like Paul. But anyway, Paul continues to be in the canon. Likewise, that Matthew and version of the Q thing where he says, I don't come to bring peace but a sword, that some people have highlighted that as not really the Jesus that they sort of like. But those Gospels and those texts have already all made it into the canon, despite the fact that they've got verses here or there that we either don't read or don't like or figure out how do we deal with. So unfortunately, when you're dealing with like a new book, this is kind of having one of these very bad verses is a big turnoff, and so it's hard to kind of get over it. That's why I spent a bunch of time on it, to just try to explain what that was going by. But you can only explain it away so much. Okay. Roan Wagner asks, so I wonder how much we have deviated from Jesus' original teaching. So for that, you would really have to. So there are multiple academically defensible cases you can make for the historical Jesus, and so because we can say very little with kind of certainty about the historical Jesus. We can say with pretty good certainty that there was a historical Jesus, that the historical Jesus was born in Nazareth, not Bethlehem, that the historical Jesus was probably a disciple of John the Baptist and was baptized by John the Baptist, that when John the Baptist was killed, the historical Jesus started leading a component of that movement and had his own disciples and followers, and had teachings, and was probably a wonder worker, and then is killed by the Roman authorities, crucified by the Roman authorities in Jerusalem, possibly because of a temple disturbance. But that isn't necessarily clear. So that's probably the whole thing that we can say with a lot of certainty. After that, there are multiple academically defensible positions. Everything from Jesus as a sort of almost a Jewish version of a Hellenistic Cynic philosopher, to Jesus as a revolutionary zealot, to Jesus as a peasant social reformer, to Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet who believed very strongly that the end of the world was going to happen immediately. And so depending on which one of those cases you make, then you'd have to say how far we moved away from that Jesus's teachings. Caleb Reinhardt says, this is a really important part to understand in the difference between Gnosticism and Christianity. I don't know at which you said that. Initially, I mean, obviously Gnosticism is a broader movement beyond Christianity. So there was Jewish Gnosticism before even there's Christian Gnosticism. Then there's also Jewish and Christian Gnosticism. There's Gnosticism influences Manichaeism. So there was Manichaean Gnosticism. And there's also outside of the Gnostic movement, there's the Mandaean religion. And so which is the main Gnostic religion that has survived to the present. And so, so at some point or other, the Christian Gnostics are Christianity, but they're not, they're considered a heresy by the main line of Christianity, which is what everyone is descended from. So in other words, none of the Christian tradition churches that exist today, they all descend from the Proto-Orthodox, the Nicene, and anyway, the other related churches, as opposed to the Gnostics, which did not survive. Okay, so Rowan Wagner says, so I wonder how we sift out the human opinion to get the real teachings of Jesus. So you don't, so is what I would say. In terms of if you're trying to do this academically, when we're using the academic tools of literary criticism, and to get to teachings, you got to use literary criticism, and but then also history. What you are not going to get away from is the human opinion, because that's what those tools are. In other words, those are academic tools. Those are human tools. So if you want to, so we're talking about the real teachings of Jesus. What you can get through human opinion is as close as you can get to the actual teachings of the historic Jesus. Now, if you're wanting the real teachings of Jesus in a Christian sense, in other words, as through worship, in other words, then you have to be understanding anyway, let's say the living Christ. You have to have the lived experience, Jesus' teachings as sacred story. And so you're not getting them through this academic exercise. This academic exercise is getting us to the historical Jesus who is gone. And that's different from how Christians understand the living Christ, who is among us in the different ways that people would understand that, either in a more immaterial way that some do, or in some sense, some a very literal way, depending on the branch of Christianity and interpretation. So here's Shaheen's comment. Shaheen said, and this is when we were talking about the ability and how the Quran was composed and also was able to be memorized in terms of oral traditions. So she writes, Quranic variations occurred in the organization of verses and in the readings, different modes of recitation, as opposed to differences in the material or content. The organization of the Quran, as we know it, now occurred during the reign of the third caliph, during the Caliphate Rashidun, so within 25 years of Muhammad's death. And so one of the things that in Islam, because it's more recent, and also because than the historical Jesus, and because Muhammad is more immediately politically important than Jesus, so it takes a long time for Christianity to become the state religion of the Roman Empire. As a result of that, there's just a lot more early documentation for the historical Muhammad than we have for the historical Jesus. In the same way, there's a lot more documentation for the historical Jesus than we have for the historical Buddha. The historical Buddha, almost all the stories that we have about the life of the Buddha, those are all legendary. That's not historical generally. Although it doesn't mean there's not a historical Buddha. It's just we can say less about him. Okay. Caleb Reinard says, it should be referring to masculine and divine and feminine concepts which are commonly associated with their respective birth genders, but are in reality is only a concept.
There's actually a few more comments in that same.
In that same part. And so, anyway, I do appreciate that. Okay, so what we're kind of talking about here is, I wasn't trying to imply, anyway, we have our understandings that we have in the 21st century about gender, right? And so we're much more knowledgeable about things like that because of just a massive increases in knowledge about physiology, biology, genetics, all of these things that people in antiquity were not aware of at all. And so, we've talked about very much how much of gender is constructs, that gender is not binary. We know that. That was even known in ancient times, that there is, for example, people who are intersex. And so as a result of that, I wouldn't even necessarily even say that ancient people necessarily were arguing on a binary point here in the same way, because even for example, people have made the point that in the Genesis story, which is all poetry, not literal, when God separates water from land and is creating two different things, there's not like there's not like a spectrum of continuity between water and land. It's not like there's no beaches, there's no wetlands, there's no swamps, there's no, all of the other kinds of, combinations that occur between the two. Likewise, we know that with gender. Gender doesn't have to be binary. Anyway, it is a, I wish that verse wasn't in the text anyway, but I appreciate that it's hard for us to wrestle with it. So Steve B says, you said these writings could be as early as 60 AD, and it has been offered that Mark is 66 AD. I usually date Mark to 70 AD, but okay, it could be 60. Some people would like Mark to be a little earlier. Do you think these could be speaking of to the chaos in Jerusalem leading to the first Jewish-Roman war? So for the 60 AD writing, so the compilation of that, this would be what we're talking about then for that earliest dating is this is the idea that there's an early Greek source that is more like Q, the Q saying source, that doesn't include the Gnostic elements. The people who are dating it to 60 are giving that kind of a date for that early part of Thomas. I don't think that they think it's being written or composed in Jerusalem. And so even already by 60, Christianity is relatively widespread across, even the whole Roman world, but especially the Greek East. And so different people are thinking that maybe, it's not clear where it would have been, composed, but it could have been composed anywhere from Syria to Alexandria. And so I don't know that there is, so in Mark, there's very clear, it's very clear that the Jewish war is going on. That's why a lot of people think it's dated to 70 because of the awareness of the text of the destruction of the temple and so on. Whereas I don't think there's nothing about that in Thomas. And so, and so as a result, I don't see the backdrop of that. Unico Adam says, maybe he meant he will elevate her like a male and not make her male. He will uphold her like a male. So yeah, so maybe, I think that maybe it means something like that. And so unfortunately, it's just unfortunate the way it's phrased. Does the final line mean something about reincarnation? Does women become men in another life? Probably not, I would say, because almost everything is an inward journey. And so probably what's happening here is that the Thomas here is saying that the physical doesn't matter, because what's happening is all human spirits are becoming the elevated form of human spirits, because they have achieved, because they're children of light, and the physical isn't what matters for the Gnostics. And so probably it's not probably meaning reincarnation, but rather it's probably meaning returning to your
you.